Good morning. Now, I think we're able to begin with today's witness, Dr. Christine Peters.
That is correct, my Lord.
Good morning, Dr. Peters. Now, as you know, you're about to answer questions from Mr. Connell, who's sitting opposite you. But first of all, I understand you're prepared to take the oath.
Yes.
Sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, we anticipate you'll be giving evidence today and into tomorrow. Our timetabling is that we usually take a coffee break at about 11:30, 20 minutes or so. But if at any time you want to take a break for whatever reason, just give me an indication and we can take a break. Just feel that you're in control of that. But with that by way of preliminary, the only other thing I would say is I would encourage you to maybe speak a little louder than you would in normal conversation. The microphones should help. Frankly, I'm hard of hearing, so I'm very conscious of the need to project. Now, Mr. Connell.
Good morning, Dr. Peters. I think you've provided a statement to the inquiry, which, unlike some, you prepared that statement. Are you content to adopt that statement as part of your evidence at this inquiry?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Now, your statement is written essentially in chronological order, and therefore I'm going to use it as a guide to take us through various things that you say. So I'll try to stick to that in the main. Just by way of preliminary, in the introductory sections, so we're at page 110 on the electronic version of the statement. I just want briefly to pick up one or two things. You say you joined the board as a consultant in August 2014. Was that your first appointment with that board?
No, I trained in Glasgow, in
Right.
NHS Glasgow, so my first appointment was in 2000. I did an SHO post in microbiology, and then I went on to become a registrar and did all my training till 2012 in Glasgow.
Right. Thank you. And you set out there some of the structures and some of the personnel, many of whom we've encountered already or will encounter in the course of this inquiry. I see on the next page, 111, that you actually became a consultant, in other words, achieved the rank of consultant in 2012, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Now, can I just ask, are you following along from a paper copy of your statement?
I have a paper copy, but I've also got the screen, so I can do either.
Conveniently, what you will find is that page 11 on your paper copy is page 111 in the bundle, so we shouldn't have any difficulty with that. And I see you first took a consultant job in Oman, a very exotic location. A consultant in what?
In clinical microbiology as well.
Thank you. And then you came back and you went to Crosshouse Hospital in Ayrshire.
Yes.
In a similar role?
Yes, clinical microbiology consultant.
One of the issues that cropped up during the evidence yesterday was that a witness explained to us that traditionally it wasn't very common for people involved in infection control to know much about buildings and estates matters, and possibly vice versa. Did you get some experience on matters concerning the built environment when you were at Crosshouse?
Yes, but before that, as a trainee, I had quite a lot of experience, and I would say that in microbiology, it's a component part of our curriculum is to understand particularly theatres, but isolation suites, water and ventilation, because it pertains to infection risks. So in order to choose the right diagnostic tests and to make informed decisions about the likely sources of infection and what treatments to give, we do need to have a thorough understanding of the environment of a hospital. So I would say that right from the beginning of my training, which was since 2000, I had a very acute awareness of the built environment and its relationship to particularly hospital-acquired infection. And at that time, there was a lot of information and attention beginning to be paid to hospital-acquired infections. So I think as part of training, that was a very key component part. And then I built on that in Crosshouse because we had new build projects, had issues with the ITU, issues with the hemato-oncology unit, that all involved using and building on that knowledge and seeking advice externally as well. So I think most people leave training with a basic level, and then you always respond to what situations arise in your practice, and then you develop further experience.
Thank you. I think you mentioned in paragraph 9 of your statement that you made a contribution to the writing of what we called High Scribe, HAI Scribe. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was being revised. It was Geraldine O'Brien, I think, who's been mentioned before, who had come down to Crosshouse because we had some building issues, and I was chairing a High Scribe meeting, and I think it was Geraldine and somebody else from HFS came and gave feedback that they thought it had gone well, and that I was asked to help, respond to a draft. And then we did some training for estates. I know that's come up a few times, the crossover of expertise. So I did a training session for the contractors in Crosshouse on HAI Scribe and infection, the basics of infection risk. And a few years later, I did the same at the Victoria Infirmary in my consultant role. So I think it's been a thread throughout my career of just trying to mesh together different expertise areas to that crossover of engineering plus infection risk.
Thank you. And in fact, I think we see on page 112, I'll use the electronic numbers because it helps the operators. Page 112, paragraph 10, you say you now lecture on a postgraduate course that started last year on related topics. Is that correct?
Yes, so that's been set up by GOSH and UCL by Professor Klutman Green. So I do a couple of days. It's been running 3 times a year, but I think the funding is maybe not there. So I'm not sure what it's going to be next year, but I have contributed to that.
Thank you. You go on in the next section of your statement to mention some of the colleagues that you had, other microbiology consultants. Can you just help us understand the relationship between being a microbiologist in a hospital and being an infection control doctor, whether lead or not, in a hospital? Are these always the same, or what's the link between them?
They're not always the same, and it's developed differently in different countries. So when I worked in Oman, for example, infection control was led by infectious diseases, and quite often people mix up infectious diseases and infection control doctors. So different countries have developed this differently. In Scotland and in the UK in general, infection control has, as a specialty, been born out of microbiology, because clinical microbiology here has been under the Royal College of Pathologists. So we're doctors, we're medics, and then we specialize in laboratory-based medicine, which is a subsection of pathology, which is microbiology. And so it's changed a lot since I started my training in 2000. It was pretty well the microbiologist who was the whole infection control team, because you've trained and you have an awareness of how infections transmit, how to intervene with that, how to diagnose it. You've got access to the laboratory. It's not the only way to divvy up the needs of a hospital that span the whole of the infection problem, if you like. But here it's very much come out of microbiology. So usually, and again, it's horses for courses. In different places, you might have one of the microbiologists as a dedicated infection control doctor, and everything will be channeled to them. It used to be you'd have more single run, you'd have hospitals with just one microbiologist, and of course that's it. They're the ICD as well. Whereas in somewhere like Glasgow, which is so big, you have maybe over 20 microbiologists. There's no need for everybody to be fully specialised in it. And there is an element of some people want to, some people don't. But we all have to have a basic level because we all cover out of hours. So out of hours and on weekends, you are effectively the infection control team. So you wear a double hat, if you like, but it's not, you don't cease becoming a microbiologist when you're doing your infection control. You're doing infection control as a microbiologist.
And just so I understand the point you make about out of hours operation, does that mean that people who are not labelled infection control can be doing infection control work because they're covering out of hours?
Yes, and also covering sick leave, covering annual leave for your infection control doctors. The way I would view it is the microbiology consultant body is a team, and we maybe have subset interests. So I, for example, will do cystic fibrosis microbiology, but it doesn't mean that when I'm off on holiday, there's nobody covering it. You have to be able to work as a team. You have to be able to share that information and ensure everybody's keeping up to speed to a certain level to be safe when others aren't around.
So do you get infection control doctors who are not microbiologists, or is that not the case?
In the UK, I think there are some public health doctors who would act as an ICD, and perhaps a virologist, but they would, usually because the way the curriculum and the training is in medicine, it's been channeled through RCPath. So I wouldn't say never, but overwhelmingly. Whereas, as I say, in other countries, it's different. In America, they have hospital epidemiologists who will do some of the work of what we would maybe do as microbiologists doing infection control. So there are different models that have evolved, and depending on how it's evolved locally in your hospital, if you don't have infectious diseases, for example, in Crosshouse, we did have one infectious diseases consultant, but obviously they couldn't be on all the time, so we would cross-cover. Whereas in somewhere like Glasgow, you've got a whole specialist infectious diseases unit, you don't then have to cover that aspect of infection. So I do think there's a lot of variation, rightly, depending on the needs of your particular situation.
And when you were first appointed to a role at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, what role were you appointed to exactly?
I was appointed as a clinical microbiologist consultant.
Right. And did that involve doing infection control work?
Yes, so initially, after I got the job, you go for interview, you get offered the job, and then when you start, there's conversations about how your sessions are going to be, what days you're going to work, and I was asked to take on the infection control remit for the southern site with my colleague who was also sharing it with me, Pauline Wright. The person who'd been doing the other half wanted to give it up, so I said yes, I would do that. At that time, it wasn't, the job planning wasn't so well exercised as it is now. So you had 2 sessions, but it didn't really mean much other than you were infection control. So you could be on the rota and something would happen in infection control and you'd have to balance both. So it's not like 2 sessions is a block of time where I had a Tuesday afternoon and a Wednesday morning, whatever, that wasn't it. You are infection control. And the way we split it was because I worked 3 days a week, I covered Monday to Wednesday, and Pauline would cover the Thursday, Friday. And we'd make sure that we both knew what was going on.
So, presumably, if there's some kind of incident, that can happen at any time, regardless of what patterns, and will then engage the attention of someone from the infection control team.
Yes.
Is that right? At that point, I understand from looking at page 112 of your statement that your line manager was Professor Leonard, who was head of microbiology, and his line manager was Professor Jones, both names we've come across. And then there was someone who was the lead ICD. And what did you understand what that meant, to be the lead ICD at that time?
It was a very different setup from Crosshouse because there wasn't an extra layer. So if you were the ICD, you had a very close relationship with the infection control nurses, estates. You were light on your feet. You could respond quickly to emerging problems, and you had rapid access to senior management of the hospital. The infection control manager there had an ICN background.
Is this Crosshouse?
In Crosshouse.
Yep.
So just to set the difference, so when I came from that setup to try and understand the new setup, it wasn't clear to me, I didn't have a job description for what areas of responsibility differentiated a sector ICD versus the lead ICD. And there was 2 lines of accountability, one for microbiology, so Alistair Leonard was for the south only, and then Brian was north and covered north and south, and Prof. Williams covered infection control across the whole of GGC. So there was, from the start, ambiguity about what exactly that meant, what you could crack on and get on with, and what you had to pass by and get approval for.
For completeness, you mentioned in 112 the existence of also a nursing team which had infection control
Yes.
responsibility, the lead ICN being Mrs. Devine, and others that you mentioned there. So that's another part of the jigsaw, is it?
Yes, so I was used to working with, so it's the ICN and the ICD are the real core. And then in a bigger team, there was surveillance and all sorts of aspects because it's a much bigger setup. So, you know, it's advantageous to have lots of people with specialist areas of responsibility and time, primarily time, because the workload is so big. But because there were multiple sets of people, the ICNs had meetings that infection control doctors weren't always invited to and would feed up through the ICN chain. So there would be a whole lot of discussions that were invisible, if you like, to the ICD. So there was, and then the ICNs would go up through Sandra, and Sandra would then liaise with Craig and Tom, who's the ICM. So it was just a bit clunky to make things work in that way, where you need to be able to act as a team rapidly in certain situations.
Yeah, you picked this up at your statement at 113, where you say there was no job description, so that nobody actually wrote it all down for you.
No.
And then you say there, in practice, issues relating to outbreaks would be discussed with the lead ICD, that's Professor Williams, by members of the IPC team, presumably whoever was involved. Is that right? Then you say there's an SMT, so a senior management team for infection control. Is that right?
Yes.
And that was the lead ICN, Mrs. Devine, Professor Williams, and Mr. Walsh.
Yes.
And then you explained that there were regular meetings. Just so we know what you're referring to, you talked there about the surveillance leads. What was a surveillance lead?
So after the Veil of Leven, there was a lot of work put into keeping track of certain infections, C. diff primarily and MRSA, and they were nationally mandated heat targets initially. It's a lot of work to do a proper surveillance system, and clearly the old-fashioned way of having piles of paper in laboratories isn't good enough. So there was a lot of good work done around automating it and having people responsible for making sure that that was done. So I think at the time it was Anne Kerr, and then after that more and more people came on board. But surveillance nurses would be appointed to do things like surgical site surveillance. So they would, if there was C-sections, for example, was I think one of the first to be under surveillance, they would go fill in the appropriate information, go to the ward, get the information, then come back and fill it in so that there was a proper tied up system of surveillance. And that was part of the team as well.
And the operation you're referring to there were C-sections, so
Yes.
cesarean sections.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, just so we're absolutely clear
Yes.
what your point was.
Yes.
When you joined that team, August 2014, the new hospital was presumably up but not occupied yet. Is that correct?
Yes, it was up.
Can I ask you about something that you don't deal with in your statement, and you may or may not be able to help us? There's been some discussion about smells deriving from neighbouring uses and what impact that did or did not have. And I don't need to ask you specifically about that side of it, but the question I had was, do you remember any discussion about whether the proximity of the neighbouring uses, particularly the sewage plant and the scrap plant, gave rise to any infection risk to the people in the hospital?
I was at the southern site for half my training because I moved between the Victoria and the south. And so it was always a matter of ridicule in a way. The smell at the south is really bad. It can be. And I've been a patient there myself with illness that includes nausea. And it is very bad for you when you are feeling unwell. In terms of infection, I think there was vague suggestions that that can't be a good thing, but I never heard it before the building was up. If you're talking about the old site, I don't think I ever was party to discussions around, shall we find out if this is a risk or not? I do not recall any conversation around that.
And do you remember whether that was raised or discussed after you started to work actively at that site? I'm thinking not so much of, is there a smell, but is there an infection risk?
I think only when infections started to happen around what has been referred to so often as the water incident, there was people beginning to say, well, is the sewage works, is that part of it? I think the smell aspect of it, I don't know enough about what vapors are involved in that smell, but I do think that there could be the risk of airborne microbes in the air. Whether that's enough of a bioburden in the air to reach, when there's so much wind up there, to be enough to get in through the ventilation system to cause infection, that would require some pretty careful study. I think it's theoretically possible, but I don't think it doesn't jump out at me. But the more interesting thing, I think, is if there's ever been leakage with works done in that area that heavily contaminated the ground when there was groundworks, and whether that could have got into water systems so there's a potential, and I'm not sure that either of those have been fully elucidated.
On 113, you then turn to what you describe as early experiences at the board, and you say you became concerned about the culture.
Yeah.
Now, the first thing you say about that is that you say that you were told by Professor Williams not to put stuff in writing in case of inquiries and things. Now, are you sure that's something that he said to you?
Yes.
Because I have to say that Professor Williams says he never said that to you. That's not something he said. Is your recollection clear about that?
Very clear indeed. It was on the phone. I know exactly when it was. It was after an incident where we had a case of Neisseria meningitidis, and I didn't think it had gone very well from an infection control point of view, and I'd put it in writing around trying to get prophylaxis for exposed staff members. There's a lot of issues around getting occupational health where I felt it was important to get the lessons out of this incident, and I straight away got a call on my phone to say, "You're in Glasgow now. We don't put things in writing because of inquiries and things." I remember the words, and I was pretty shocked.
Can I just get as much detail on that so we can tie it to a specific instance? So you're talking about a phone call.
Yes.
Phone call was initiated by Professor Williams,
Yes.
you say, and you're in Glasgow now. We don't
put things in writing.
Now, this arose in relation to a particular case, and I think you mentioned an infection, a particular microorganism, and I didn't get it.
So Neisseria meningitidis, it causes meningitis.
Right. Right. Can I take that at dictation?
Meningitidis. MENGI. Oh, sorry, I have to write it.
Sorry, this is not supposed to be a spelling
I
test.
know, I can't quite
Right.
think of the MENGITIS.
MEN.
IN.
IN.
GITIDIS. Meningitidis.
Right. Thank you.
Sorry.
Just on a sort of administrative point, Mr. Connell, I wonder if you are on the same page as the screen. I think you've referred to paragraph 19 as being on page 113.
Yes, I'm not on the same page as on the screen. You're
Right.
quite right.
I mean, I don't think it necessarily causes a problem, but
yes, the numbers seem to be different to the ones I
Right,
was
yeah.
advised of. So yes, my set of papers suggests page 113 is a different page, but not to worry. We'll follow that. So that we should be at 112 on the electronic.
Yeah.
In fact, the information I gave you, Dr. Peters, is incorrect. The numbering is out by 1. So page 13 in the paper copy is 112, which will cause a few quirks later. Anyway, I think you were telling His Lordship that there was a specific incident. You thought some things needed to be done and lessons needed to be learned, and you emailed or
Yes.
wrote?
I emailed.
And who did you email?
Prof. Williams, and I would have emailed, I would have to check the email, I'm sure I can find it, but I would expect that I would send it to Pauline Wright, my colleague, and the ICNs involved. Because Pauline was involved in that incident because we'd gone down to we were doing an IT ward round together. It was very early in my days there, and we'd had to call the ICNs who were busy doing something else, so we just dealt with this. It was I mean, I remember all about the case, but it was, we thought people had been exposed because they hadn't worn PPE, so we were quite keen to get the prophylaxis sorted.
You just so we come back to that, your reaction to that was shocked. Why were you shocked?
Because it's good practice to record, to get lessons learned, to avoid ambiguity. And because we're across a big site, emails are the main way of communicating in writing. So we had SMTs once a month, which isn't the place to do your discussions, if you like, talking about situations. If it was in other settings that I've been in, where the ICN comes to the lab, you'd maybe discuss things every day, but this was we had an SMT that was on another site, quite aloof. And And in order to keep him up to date as my lead, I thought it was important for him to understand and to maybe come back with, well, actually, this is a better way to do it. We should here are the actions we need to do. And instead, I got a phone call to say, don't put things in writing. And I'm sure I discussed it with my colleagues to say, and basically people said, yeah, that's Craig.
What did they say was great? Writing it down or not writing it down?
Not writing it down. Don't put things in writing.
The other issue that you talk about in paragraph 19 of your statement is something that you say happened at your first SMT meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So why were you routinely at an SMT meeting? Because that's Mrs.
Yes.
Devine, Professor Williams, and Mr. Walsh.
Yeah, so there's a bit of confusion about that. The SMT management trio are what we've already discussed. The SMT meetings were ones that the ICDs and the lead ICNs and surveillance and public health would come to once a month. And they were the SMT meetings, which are different from the three meeting up separately. I don't know what meetings they had or how they were recorded, but this was called the SMT. And there's minutes, I think, in your bundles of that meeting. So we were expected, it was the only management meeting that we were expected to go to as ICDs at that time. We did not attend AICC or BICC, which were two levels of management meetings above where the local ICD would sit, which I think, again, was problematic because throughout the organisation, you've got the person with the responsibility and the training of doing the infection control doctor work, and then you've got levels of meetings that you're blind to, or at least that you cannot participate in.
Can I ask you about participation? Because what you say here is that you were told you really shouldn't ask questions.
Yes.
Again, are you sure this is something you were told?
Yes, very sure.
And this was by a doctor, I may not get the pronunciation right.
Bagradi. Yes.
Who's a lady, I think.
Yes.
Who's she?
She was at the time the ICD for Clyde. She was in the Clyde sector. She'd been involved in the Vale of Leven and all of that as well. And she would attend this meeting. All the ICDs attended this meeting, and I went to my first one, just having come from Crosshouse, where meetings were all about hearing what people had to say and working through issues, coming to some consensus, and then getting actions that we could all sign up to, and everybody knew walking away from the meeting, just a functional meeting. And so I was keen to talk about things that I'd want to know more about or present. I can't remember if that one was before or after that incident, but there were, other things that I discovered that I wanted to talk about. And afterwards, Linda said to me, we're not here to ask questions. And we had a bit of discussion, and I said, there's no point in me being at a meeting if I have to be silent.
You say you raised concerns with your line manager, Professor Leonard. Is that right?
Yes.
What when you say you raised your concerns, what were you concerned about?
I think that was a couple months more in, because I thought this is maybe just bedding down time. But I spoke to Prof. Leonard. He was in an office just next to my office, basically, and he was my lead from a microbiology point of view. So he was actually the person there. I was aware that there had been a lot of issues prior to my starting in Glasgow between the microbiology and infection control, even though it's actually all microbiology because it was Prof. Williams and Prof. Jones and Prof. Leonard. So there had been a lot of difficulties, I think, with those teams working. And I remember saying to him, look, you've tried to sort out the situation in microbiology with the way that Prof. Williams was managing it, but you've put him in infection control, and then you've allowed us ICDs, you just pushed us there, and nobody's monitoring how that team is working as well. So I did try to raise it with him and say that some of the concerns were there were no minutes of the ICD meetings were very ad hoc, they weren't minuted. I felt that my colleagues were very fearful in the meetings. There was anxiety in attending meetings, anxiety anytime you got a phone call. People would describe shaking. It was just a really unhealthy situation.
Now, perhaps we could just go on to the next page, which is 113 or 14, as we're now working out on your paper copy, because you say there you'd identified a number of areas of concern. Now, so far as ICD meetings, what apparently Professor Williams says is that there were ICD meetings and they were deliberately not minuted, and you weren't comfortable with that and complained about it. Is that correct or incorrect?
They weren't minuted, that is correct, and I was uncomfortable with it because what happened was there would be what we thought was a decision, an instruction, some sort of conclusion. You'd go away, you'd act on it, and then the next time, oh no, that wasn't the decision. So you felt like things were taken out from under you. It was not an informal, supportive chat, which would have been quite a nice thing to have. It was a place where decisions were made and there was different opinions, and then there was no record of it. So you constantly felt like you didn't actually know. It was very insecure. My colleagues also wanted it minuted to know this is what we discussed, or for the people who missed it, because you're on annual leave or for you had to cover microbiology, whatever you were doing, there was a record. It just seemed basic, obvious practice.
One of the issues that crops up, Dr. Peters, when people talk about your own performance is whether you respect the views of others. Are you comfortable with an open discussion where different views are expressed?
Very much. I think that's exactly what's needed. And that's what I would practice when I was clinical lead. In our weekly meetings, I instigated weekly minuted meetings specifically for that purpose. And it's an opportunity to ask other people what their opinions are, because in any group of microbiologists, you're going to have a range of experience, a range of expertise. Somebody may have just read a paper you've not read. It's an opportunity for peer review and check. I work across multidisciplinary teams, have done all my career. I very much value everybody's input. So yes, I think it's vital to have multidisciplinary and also within team. You need a situation where people feel comfortable as well to bring a different view. And usually I would, if ever when I was chairing meetings, say my piece, I'd say, does anybody else have a different view?
Just so we've got the past individuals correct, you say in that list of concerns at Roman 4, interactions between microbiology lead and infection control lead were dysfunctional. Who were these two individuals?
Craig Williams and Brian Jones.
But I think Professor Williams would say he was not aware of any dysfunction in the relationship he had with Brian Jones.
Well, he would not attend the microbiology meetings, microbiology management team meetings, and this was always noted by Prof. Jones. There is a document I think I've attached which delineates in Prof. Jones's handwriting, Prof. Jones's views on Craig Williams' interactions with microbiology. So it was not I was not the first person. I walked into a situation of great dysfunctionality, and I was not the only person. And indeed, when there was the OD session with Dave Stewart, it was clear that there were big issues, and they weren't all related to me.
I think you also mentioned on the same page that you felt bullied, and others, you say, felt bullied. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've mentioned Professor Jones, and then ultimately, a significant number of people, you say, supported a document complaining about Professor Williams. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, Professor Williams would say he knows nothing about that document. He's never seen it. Can you help us on that? Was it something he would see or not?
It was written by Prof. Jones, who was head of service, so I would have expected Prof. Jones in his role and with communications with higher management to ensure that those matters were discussed.
But you don't know directly whether he did or did not.
No.
Other things you complain about Professor Williams, we find on 114, where you say he was away a lot. Now he doesn't accept he was away a lot. Do you have anything to add on that?
I think it would be hard to evidence now. It was a impression a lot of us shared. He wouldn't answer his phone, or you'd find out he was away. He did cover the Western Isles, so he'd be up at the Western Isles. There was because he didn't work within microbiology, within our department, we'd have a calendar, so you would know exactly when everybody was off on annual leave, so you could plan around it, and you try not to overlap with other people. His was invisible to everybody else, so I've no proof of it. I would just say that was the impression.
And you mentioned that he had this post in the Western Isles, and I think Professor Williams accepted he had a post in the Western Isles, but he says that was only a day every few months.
He was on call for them all the time, along with Dr. Bagradi. So that was the impression.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, let's move on. I see on that page we're turning to heading towards the opening of the new hospital. Professor Williams at that time was to be the lead ICD. You were sharing sector ICDs with Dr. Wright that you've already told us. You say there you took the lead on issues relating to the built environment. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, it's not a role, so I wasn't lead for. It was between the two of us. We would divvy up jobs. So Dr. Wright wasn't interested or was happy for me to take on the more ventilation. That emerged because there were issues in the old estate that I identified. So having come from Crosshouse with experience of HI Scribe and all of that, the particular thing that brought it to us discussing like who would take it forward was just the corridor into our old ITU had a really bad leak from the ceiling tiles, just exactly where people were trolleyed into ITU.
This is old estate.
Old
this is not in the
estate.
new hospital.
Yeah, in the old estate. And so I thought this was not a good thing, and I wanted to progress, decide with the state. So between us, we discussed that I would take that forward. She wouldn't have to deal with it on a Thursday, Friday. So that's what I mean by taking the lead. It was not a lead role.
And in terms of your then colleague, Dr. Wright, was there any difficulty with her that you were focusing on one thing and she was on another?
Not at all. We worked very well together.
Although I see she had responsibility for Legionella specifically. What you then say is that as you were heading towards approaching the opening, you were asking for information about ventilation and water. What kind of things were you looking for?
Just an overarching, I knew nothing about the building, and I felt that as being the ICD, we should understand what rooms we have, what's the ventilation strategy, specialist water systems, the high-risk units, what we needed to put in place going forward for monitoring, just all the really basic things you'd expect an ICD to do. I would have liked to have the heads up to, this huge building. It was going to be a massive effort to put these 3 hospitals together. And there was going to be a lot of challenges. It's definitely not an easy thing to do. But for our role in microbiology, there was all the stuff around the diagnostic tests, how we were going to deal with those big numbers coming. And in terms of infection control, I wanted to have a awareness and be informed so that if there were problems, and you can anticipate problems in any building project, that I was in a position to start to understand it and clinically risk assess as things went on. So, yes.
But we're going to come back at a later stage of your statement to some exchanges over, in particular, ventilation air change rates, which happened in 2016. But just to try and stick to the chronology for the moment, this is presumably, late 2014, running into 2015?
Yeah, I would say more into 2015. I did have a tour at the end of 2014 with Dr. Wright. So that was part of our orientation. So you could get an orientation tour, but it was really a building site. We had to wear helmets, and it was really just, where's the ITU, so that because we do daily ITU ward rounds, where's the theatres, where's that sort of thing. So I did have that tour. And the first time I think I started to think, I'm not sure this is right, was on that tour. I think it was Mary McLeod who was on the project team, and Jackie Balmanroy happened to be on that same tour. And I did notice the sinks had greenish puddles just where the drain is. I'd commented on it, and Jackie said that they were compliant, the sinks were compliant, and that was all okay. And then we went to the isolation room in the ITU setting, and because we'd put in PPVL rooms in Crosshouse for the ID unit, I was familiar with the parameters for it. And she said it was a negative pressure room, and I said it's not it can't be a negative pressure room. This doesn't look like a negative pressure room. And she just said Prof. Williams has signed it off as a negative pressure room. That's what she said. Whether he had or not, I don't know, but that was what was said.
This was the stage before there were patients in the hospital,
yes,
is that correct?
Before. It was a building site, basically. There's loads of workers everywhere.
Can I just ask you generally, when you were trying to get information that you thought would be useful to sort of set you up for the time when patients were in, did you find that easy to get?
I got no information. No, I asked at the SMT, and Sandra McNamee said that it was fully naturally ventilated, and I thought that can't be right. And I think at one stage she described...
Sorry to interrupt, but why did you think that can't be right?
Well, you've got specialist units, so you're going to have mechanical ventilation to some degree. And secondly, all the windows are sealed. So everybody was talking about these sealed windows because of the smell. So there was that. So the windows weren't opening. You could tell that as you went round anyway. It's because normally there's a way to stop them opening too far.
Yeah.
So there's no opening device. There's nothing. They're sealed.
Yeah, I think you're talking about a device to basically prevent people opening them and falling out.
And falling out, yeah. And it's a very tall building. So there was a discussion, and I was taken aback because I thought, oh, maybe I don't understand ventilation at all, because she mentioned some chimney effect, and there's some very modern way of channeling air through buildings that would work. And whether that was discussed at some point, I don't know. But in terms of what I'd seen, I thought this cannot be fully naturally ventilated. But when I emailed, so I'd asked for a vague handover. I think I'm not sure I've submitted that email. I'd sort of said, can I have, all this information that'd be really useful before patients come? And then patients moved, I hadn't seen anything. And then I think it goes on to when I start to discover more issues. But prior to patients moving in, I had nothing.
Just so I'm following, are these questions being raised at SMT meetings?
Yes.
Or,
Both.
I mean, can you just give me more detail as to how you were raising these questions and with whom?
So at the SMT meeting, I asked, can we have details of the ventilation? I can't remember if I said water or not. I definitely said ventilation because I'm actually more interested in ventilation, but I did ask for specs on the building. And then I followed up with an email to Prof. Williams.
This is in 2014 or we're
15.
in 2015?
Early 2015.
Right. In one SMT meeting or more than one?
I think it was probably one because what was also at the same time as me saying about these non-minuted ICD meetings, there were cancelled SMTs. So in 2014, there were a whole lot of, I think we went 4 months without an SMT, and I raised that as a problem as well with Tom Walsh. And I think that's probably why one of them was made to be a special SMT to discuss the Vale-Leven report. So they replaced the SMT with the Vale-Leven report, but we'd had one cancelled because it was too close to Christmas, and we'd had one cancelled before that. So there were cancelled meetings. And I thought that we had a lot, I mean, we're massive, and we were just about to open this big building, and there were ongoing matters to discuss. So that's maybe why I didn't raise it. I only recall raising it at one meeting.
Right. Now, I take it there should have been stage 4 H-scribe completed, but I'm also sometime in 2015, but I'm also working on the basis that you had nothing to do with that.
Nothing.
Right.
I don't know if one was done.
Right. Now, what was Professor Williams' response to your request for the information that you've listed with Mr. Connell?
The first email, no response.
Just absence of response.
Absence of response.
At the SMT meeting, I take it he was present?
I don't recall him saying anything at that SMT. I remember Sandra, that all I recall is Sandra saying that. I do recall at other SMTs.
Mrs. Devine made the comment about natural ventilation at the SMT.
Yes, yes, yes. I don't absolutely remember if Craig was there at that meeting, but I do recall that at an SMT, and I can't place if it was exactly the same one or not, he mentioned about ventilation, water, he was dealing with it, things were sorted. Just at that level of, there's been discussions about TB, MDR TB, that's been sorted, water's under control, that was the impression. So I wasn't at that stage questioning that anything was wrong at all. I had no idea things were wrong. I was just asking for the information to enable me to do my job. So at that stage, I really didn't expect there to be a problem.
Now, we're talking about when you had the tour
Yes.
With Dr. Wright, probably at the end of 2014. Did you say that Mary McLeod was with you on that occasion?
I think it was Mary McLeod. Somebody showed us around who was part of the project team. I didn't really know who was in the project team. I didn't have locus or visibility of any of that. I knew Jackie Balmonroy was somehow linked with it because she mentioned she'd chosen the sinks and she'd been involved. And I don't know the mechanics of it. I had no visibility of it.
Now, it was during that visit, if I'm following you correctly, that somebody said to you that Professor Williams had signed it off.
Yeah.
Can you remember who told you that?
Well, I think it was. I have notes that I thought it was Mary McLeod, but I'm just now.
Right.
I don't know her very well, so I'm not sure I would be absolutely sure about that. I could check my emails. I think the name would be there.
When that expression was used to you, how did you understand it? I mean, signed what off?
Yeah, I understood it to be an HAI scribe because I signed off scribes in Crosshouse. So I thought that's it, signed off.
But if the hospital was still a construction site, that was perhaps a little early to do a stage 4H scribe.
Yes.
But
It could have been an earlier stage, so it could have been signed off. I didn't take it as signed off, ready for patients to go in. I took it as signed off, this is what we want.
right, okay, thank you.
Yeah, just for completeness, and we needn't go back to it at 113 of your statement, you touch on the discussion on the Vale of Leave in hospital and your reaction to what the focus of the discussion was, which you say was on coverage of cost, not on people. So I needn't bother to get you specifically to read that, but sticking now to 114, you're saying you'd no involvement in the design or commissioning of the hospital because by the time you got there, it was well underway. And I think on the next page, 115, electronic. Sorry, Molly, I'm now discovering that the page paragraphs on my copy are quite different from the page paragraphs. Yeah, I think that's because I have a copy of Dr. Peter's paper version. But we'll deal with that. What you say there is that you understood, and I assume you got that understanding just from talking to people, that Dr. Hood and Dr. Redding had been involved, as had Annette Rankin, and the ICD involved in the new project, you understood, was Professor Williams, who at the time was the lead ICD. Now, I think Professor Williams will say that he didn't sign off on anything of substance other than some discussions about individual rooms, and certainly didn't sign off anything general. Did you have any specific information about his role, or is this just general?
This is from SMTs where he would report back, and also from an email I got from Tom Walsh that when I asked after the patients were in, when I started asking more urgently for information, Tom Walsh indicated that it was Prof. Williams and Jackie Balmonroy.
We'll come to that.
That's later. So that's what that's based on. And I think there was just a perception because he was lead ICD and it had not been delegated, or there were no meetings or anything that we were involved in. We didn't have visibility of it. So the impression and I suppose assumption was that it was those people involved.
And you say in your statement that you were getting some general updates about the building from Professor Williams, but not technical information about it, just sort of how things are going, presumably.
Yeah.
So you actually record at the end of 27, paragraph 27, which is on electronic 115, that prior to the opening, you didn't get any information about the ventilation and water systems, although you'd have found that helpful.
Yes.
In fact, in the next section of your statement on that page, you're dealing with high scribe. And I was going to ask you about stage 4 high scribe for the new building on opening, but you don't know whether one was done or not.
No. I think not, because of what we found. Because scribe part 4 is basically you're finishing off and you're going around and you're saying, yes, the ventilation is as, SHTM says. It's got a whole lot of tick boxes that you have to check. You have to visibly, it's a check. And the fact that those things were not there, I assume it wasn't done, or I'm not sure if they were picked up where the actions went, because you would expect actions to flow from that scribe if it was incorrect.
Thank you. Yes, because if you pick something up, you're supposed to do something about it, presumably.
Yes.
So your current assumption is that one wasn't done.
Yes.
I think it's pretty clear from what you said already, Dr. Peters, but just can I absolutely nail this down? It appears to me from your previous answers that you are familiar with the HI scribe procedure, have actually carried it out in
Yes.
previous roles.
Yes.
Have you actually have you carried out a stage 4?
Yes, with the team in Crosshouse, but it wasn't for a big build, it was for refurbishment. So it was a small one compared to what would be required for this. Mm-hmm. And it involved, the way I experienced it, it involved like fire people as well as the clinical team. And it wasn't a piece of paper. To me, a scribe was a meeting of people at key points. So, and that's where Gillian and Brian came and observed what we were doing, because we weren't treating it as a piece of paper. The scribe isn't the paper. The scribe is the content that goes into the paper. So you could say, a fire happy with the fact that we've now got these dampers, or they're not happy usually because we haven't got the double doors or whatever it is. So, and then if you want work to be done, and we'll have grand ideas of how it should be done, and fire will come and say, you can't use that route. So you've got to work together on all the competing interests to make sure that A, the project while it's being done is being done safely, and B, that the project is worth doing because it delivers the improvement that you're wanting.
Yes, that answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord. Now, I was going on to paragraph 30, which starts at electronic 115. It's page 16 on your paper copy, where you say you first became aware of some issues. And in fact, as it happens, you've given us the evidence about the drainage outlet on the sinks in terms of explaining your first walk around. And then you're also saying you were looking at a room that was under construction, and you were told it was an NPV, a negative pressure room. Mm-hmm. Why would you have a negative pressure room in a hospital?
For airborne isolation. So they're specifically designed to prevent aerosol infectious risk from coming out of the room, and also from concentrating up within the room. So if you have a patient who's breathing out, coughing out an infectious agent such as TB, chickenpox, coronavirus, MERS, you would be not wanting those aerosols to leak out into the other parts of the ward, or to infect anybody coming into the room, because they need to be removed rapidly. So it's not just the pressure, it's the air changes. So you need rapid dilution as well. So they're very carefully designed. So a negative pressure room to me is not just a single room that happens to have a little bit of negative pressure one way half the day and the other way the other half. It's a designed and validated suite that should function for negative pressure. So it is primarily for aerosol infection.
Yes. And in paragraph 30, I think you're probably going back there to the point that you discussed earlier, that you were shown what you were told was a a negative pressure room, and you said that's not a negative pressure room, and you were told it had been signed off as one by Professor Williams. And that was because, I understand from your statement, that it was a positive pressure room, but it had a lobby.
So no, it wasn't a positive pressure room, it was a positive pressure ventilated lobby room. So the positive pressure pertains to the lobby, not the actual room. And to be fair, the person who said it was a negative pressure room possibly wouldn't have known. And there is a lot of debate about whether these PPVL rooms are adequate for your highly infectious aerosol protection and your highly immunocompromised patients. So people, it's a bit niche to understand the differences, but I'm sure you do because of the inquiry, but not everybody does. So if you say negative pressure room, it's shorthand for saying that's where we're going to put our TB case. So I'm not sure the person was saying that Prof. Williams thought it was a negative pressure room. I don't believe he did. It's a positive pressure ventilated lobbied room. The question emerges as to whether that's the correct design for a highly infectious aerosol transmitted disease. And the second question is it built to actually meet the spec of a PPVL room? So there's two aspects to whether that was the right room or not.
Thank you. Now, moving to paragraph 31 in your statement, which is on electronic 116, you're talking about a different walk around, and you were trying to plan for viral hemorrhagic fever admissions. Is that something you needed to do?
Yes, it's something that all ICDs were involved in doing because there was an Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, and I'd already in Crosshouse we'd had a query case before. So and in Glasgow they'd had a Crimean Congo fever case. So there was a lot of awareness that we weren't really prepared for this kind of infection if they just turned up at our A&Es. So we were all tasked with, and I'm sure if you spoke to ICDs across the country, it was a time of great activity going into your A&E, trying to work out what the plan was so you didn't get caught on the hop. So how would you triage? How would you know somebody might meet the criteria? Where would you place them? Where's the PPE? How you would house them, route through the hospital. So it was very much a national effort at planning, because you would never know where somebody might turn up with. At that time, the biggest threat was Ebola, but there are other serious high consequence infectious diseases, as they're termed.
And in the course of this walk around, now this is after the patients or just as the patients are moving in?
I think it's after, because I had been doing it in the old sites. So I'd already done the Victoria Infirmary and the old Southern A&E. And one of the features that everybody, we knew it wasn't a great setting for if a patient came in, there was a lot of risks. But we kept saying, but in the new hospital, we're going to have isolation rooms and A&E, so it's going to be dead easy. And then I thought, right, we'll just walk it through. I think patients were in, but I can't be sure 100% about that date in April. I'm sure I could check. I don't exactly remember because it was down in A&E and I didn't go into where patients would be. I just went into the room.
Anyway, you went into a room. I assume from what you were telling me that you'd be looking for a negative pressure environment.
Yes.
And in fact, you found a room that had a number of defects with it, which you've listed. And you tried to find out whether it was a negative pressure room, or if not, where the negative pressure rooms were. You then say you were told there weren't any negative pressure rooms anywhere.
Yes.
Was that not something that surprised you?
Very much. Because there was we'd moved our infectious diseases unit across the city to be in this, state-of-the-art premises. We had nice suites, negative pressure rooms at the old Brownlee unit. And I was a bit astonished by that. I think this room was the decontamination room, which is meant for chemical incidents. So it has slightly similar features in that you don't want contaminant, be it a different kind, not a biological contaminant, you don't want that coming out of the room, but it serves a very different function. I would also say that for viral hemorrhagic fever, if you were planning for it and were building for it, you would also do it a bit differently from MTB because there's a bigger risk of contact and transmission, so droplets, and so you wouldn't really want a positive pressure in the lobby, and you want a big lobby so you can have, and you really want a dirty to clean flow through, so you want somewhere where your staff can put on your PPE, go into the room and then come out and doff in a different place so that there's not cross-contamination. So I wasn't expecting an HCID room, although it was a missed opportunity really not to put one in, but I was expecting probably a negative pressure room with a really big lobby. But it was just a funny design for this chemical disinfection. I'm not an expert in chemical disinfection, so I don't know whether that was appropriate or not for that purpose, but it seemed to me that it wasn't functioning for what I was expecting it to function for. On top of that, there was, the ceiling tile, there was a ladder, the doors kept opening and closing, the water wasn't coming out, all these features that I've mentioned. So it seemed to me that on that day, if an Ebola patient came in today, this is not where we want to put them.
Dr. Kennedy suggests that at the time you're talking about, the Brownlee unit hadn't yet moved into the new hospital. Is he correct about that?
The first visit, potentially. But they moved, the second time I went, they definitely did, because we would then start talking about MERS patients with Dr. Bell. So it's possibly true that on that day they weren't there, but this was a planning meeting. I don't know the exact date the Brownlee came over.
He also suggests that it's the public health team that were in charge of significant infectious disease planning for the new hospital. Is that correct?
He chaired a meeting that was for serious infectious disease, but that didn't mean that the ICDs didn't also have a role in preparing it. So there's a massive public health role because of the risk to public, but there's also a massive infection control role in dealing with a VHF. And I think you'd find in every hospital, the ICDs were very much involved in ensuring that the details of an admission, clean-up, how you would decontaminate a room, all these things needed to be planned for.
Thank you. Well, let's see if we can move on to another period of time which you've helpfully given us a heading for. June 2015, paragraph 32, still on page 116, electronic. You said, and I think you've probably told us this already, you'd sought information from Professor Williams in the hope of being reassured, and you asked for technical information like ventilation schematics. What would you do if you got ventilation schematics? Can you read them?
Yes.
This is probably the point that we touched on briefly in passing earlier, that you were in touch with someone called Anne Harkness, who was who?
She was the acute sector general manager.
So
just so that I'm following, I'm not entirely sure that I know what ventilation schematics might be. Do you want to tell me about it?
So, for example, if you're looking at a PPVL room and you're getting it validated, you'd have where the ventilation supply and extract is, and you'd get the pressure differentials. There's, on top of that, a much more detailed schematic of exactly where all the ducting would go, whether it fed into what air handling unit, were the air handling units close by, which level they're on. So it's understanding, from an infection point of view, all you need to know is where's the air going, how much air and where's it going.
Yes. So what that's suggesting to me is something like a drawing, but not necessarily drawn to exact scale. Is that right?
Some are drawn to scale. So if you were looking at, so there's two things. There's how it was designed and the as-built, as somebody's already referred to. And then there would be, I would have seen the validation data. So we're very used to looking at validation for these suites and theatres. And then you can see the bigger drawings will show you how it relates to the rest of the hospital. So you can see where your routes might go. There's a word for it, adjacencies. So you can see where these rooms are in proximity to A&E and to other parts, X-ray. You can see, if you have time, and most of our problems we don't have time, you can follow through the scheme of where the actual ducts are going, so that you can check that it's not recirculating air to somewhere else, that sort of thing. So I wouldn't have expected an engineer's level. I'm not an engineer, so I'm not going to be able to assess it like an engineer and check where all the dampers are and all those kind of pressures. But I'm looking at them from an infection control point of view, which is, are the supplies in the right place? Are the pressures in the right place? Do we have the air exchanges right? And if you've worked in infection control, you know that's often wrong.
All right. So going back to just getting an idea what might be comprehended by schematics, I think it includes drawings.
Yeah.
And from what you just answered, it would include scale drawing.
Yes, not precise scale. So in the end, I got these big, huge laminated maps. I suppose it's maps rather than schematics of where the electricity is. I mean, I've seen those kind of schematics and they're not very helpful for what I need to see, but it's more a map, roughly to scale, but not exactly to scale.
Right. Okay. I think I've got the idea.
Yeah.
So it's quite detailed information you are looking for.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Sorry, Mr. Cole.
No, but perhaps I can just check then if there are two different phrases appearing here, because you say you asked for technical information like ventilation schematics. And did you get it? That's logical.
No. Eventually, I got the theatres, what they call the validation, but I think I'm not sure which stage of validation that was. That was sent to me, and that was to be taken forward through Craig and Anne Harkness as well. So schematics, I don't know, I may be using that to non-specifically. For me, a schematic is a drawing on a piece of paper that I can understand the parameters that I need to understand the infection risk.
And you according to your statement here in paragraph 32, you say that you told Anne Harkness you would review the ventilation specifications. Now, is that different from schematics?
The schematic should reflect the specification. So when you see validation and you know from SHTM what it should be, and then you see the readings, and then you can surmise that it's either correct or incorrect. And you'd be surprised that we are actually able to pick up problems. I think sometimes people don't like the theatres and neurosurgical theatres. They've been validated and validated and validated, but then you get a fresh pair of eyes looking at it from an infection point of view, and actually there's some pretty serious defects going on. So it is surprising that doctors are able to identify what you might think are engineering issues, but we are trained to be able to highlight those specific parameters of engineering that pertain to infection risk.
In any event, you were in touch with Anne Harkness, and you said you would review the ventilation specifications, and she told you, oh, you don't need to because Professor Williams has done it. Is that correct? That what she said?
Yes.
But Professor Williams, I think, says that he didn't sign off on specifications at all.
Yeah, so it was mixed messages. I didn't know what was going on. I think those specific specifications were for that contamination room, and the reason I wanted them was the plan for an Ebola case. And nobody seemed to know where the air comes in and goes out, whether it's public health or anybody else. It was just, this is the room we're going to use. And I wanted to be able to check, so that use my training in order to say, well, actually, yes, this is good, the air goes this way, or not. And what the ACH is. And then if that is the only option, can we risk mitigate? Or is there another better option? So it's asking for a granularity of information that you actually require to do a proper job, a proper clinical job on infection risk. So I didn't then know who had the information, who'd looked at the information, and that was very worrying.
But you mentioned mixed messages. If we go on to electronic 117, you record there, it comes from over the page as well, that according to you, Professor Williams said, oh, everything's fine. And then he said, well, actually, it wasn't really his thing, ventilation. Is that was that said, actually said to you by Professor Williams?
It's the emails. I think it's that bit is all in emails.
And you were directed to Mr. Powery for information in the
Yes.
Estates Department.
Yes.
Now, did the fact that you were being told to go and ask Estates about the ventilation concern you?
No, it seemed, well, estates would be the people who know, but I was thinking of asking, in fact, who I thought was the infection control doctor who would know about the spec from an infection control point of view. So would be able to say, yes, we're going to use this room and it's negative pressure in the lobby, it's negative pressure, we've got X amount of air changes, and here's what we'd have to do to decontaminate it. That's the kind of handover by somebody who's already planned the thing out and done the work already. That would be great, because then I can understand and say, okay, now I know. Whereas, fair enough, estates will have schematics and they will have it from an engineering point of view, and they'll be looking at it from how do they keep this functioning? Are there any defects? They will be coming at it from their job point of view.
I wonder if we could look at Bundle 14, Volume 1, 320, please. Now, I see here we've in the middle of that page 320, we've got an email from you to Tom Walsh, copy to Teresa Inkster, saying, hi Tom, Craig indicated to me he had not had information on the ventilation systems. I should liaise with Ian Powery. Can we discuss? So you're in touch with Mr. Walsh as well?
Yes. So Craig was on annual leave then. Teresa, I copied in because she was covering for his lead role. And he's the manager, so that's the next person to go to for information.
Can we just go on to 321, please? And can we just see? Oh yes. So this is you. You're in touch with Craig Williams, but that arises from a communication from someone called David Bell. Who's David Bell?
He's an infectious diseases consultant who at the time had responsibility for the VHF type pathway.
And this is where there's a reference. I see you're asking about the decontamination room, so the specific room that we've been discussing.
Yes.
And he's saying to you, can I have your infection control input, particularly around ventilation? We were told it was suitable. And it says Craig Williams via Anne Harkness. And then I identified another area, then there's some discussions about PPE. So is that the kind of exchange that you're telling us about?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, if we go back to your statement where we were before, paragraph 33, you say you were starting to question the sign-off of the new building. And you describe a decontamination room, and you say that's the same one we've already discussed. And then in paragraph 34 on the same page, you say you asked, well, who's signed off? And Mr. Walsh tells you it's Professor Williams, Dr. Hood, and Jackie Bauman Roy. Is that right?
Yes.
I think I will ask you about it again after this, but I think you probably know that Professor Williams denies any significant role in signing off ventilation on the new hospital. Are you able to comment on that one way or the other?
No, I don't know for a fact who signed off. All I know is what I was told. So that's what I was told.
Can I ask you again, what do you have in mind when you use the expression signed off?
At that point, that's a different sign-off. That's a scribe 4 sign-off. That's a we're ready to put patients in this room. And even if you'd not done every single room in the hospital, the one room, I mean, there are many rooms, you should do it for all of them, but this is a really high-risk room, both for chemicals and, on a risk register, this is a room you got to get right. So that's when I started to worry about the scribe 4 sign off, if you like,
so
that it's ready for people now.
Again, it's stage 4.
Yes.
Right, okay, thank you.
Just so we've got that, can we look at Bundle 14, Volume 1, 205, please? So this is you asking how was the design of the new build signed off from an infection control point of view? Is that the point you're trying to make? That's what you're trying to find out?
Just finding out the information that I need to do my job.
Yeah. Can we just go back to 204 to see if that helps us? I think if we just shrink the page a little so we can see all of page 204. Yes, this is the reply that you've talked about, the reply from Tom Walsh saying, hi Christine, Craig led on most of this with some input from John Hood. Design sign-off was by Jackie in the South team while she was seconded to the project. Now, Jackie Bauman Roy was what?
An ICN.
Infection
Control nurse.
control nurse. Right. Thank you. And you then decided you wanted to meet with Mr. Parry to discuss a number of these issues, is that right?
Yes.
And did you arrange to meet him?
Yes. So I'd had discussions with him. I had never met him before this all started kicking off. So I don't think you have all my emails, but I wrote to him to introduce myself and say, copied in Pauline and Teresa, say that we're the local ICDs, we'd like to have some information. I think I met him because he was in the same building. They're just on the ground floor. States are on the ground floor and we're on the 4th floor. He was extremely busy. And he agreed that it would be a good idea to tee up. He had concerns of his own, is the impression I got. And he seemed very keen to come to a meeting if I was to organise it. Teresa was standing in for Craig as lead ICD, so it seemed the appropriate group, just as a preliminary, what's going on? Where are we at? It seemed like we didn't have any information, so this was a fact-finding exercise, and Ian was very helpful with that.
And you also suggested, or someone arranged perhaps, that somebody from the contractors, Brookfield,
Yes.
Appeared, and also from the commissioning team.
Yes, David Hall was there.
David Hall.
Yes.
And then you go on thereafter to discuss, if we now go back to your statement, we'll get to paragraph 34 on your statement, which is on 117. You set out there a number of issues. And the first one touches on water. Now, you say there were verbal reports of possible Legionella contamination. So this is June. So this is just about the time when patients are coming in, is that right?
Oh, I think the migration was well on its way. I think it started at the end of April.
Right.
So I'm not sure about the final dates, but there'd certainly been lots of people. A lot of the hospital had been migrated by that stage. I'm not 100% sure of that timetable.
And you said there wasn't anything in writing, and Mr. Parry, according to you, said he didn't want to put it in writing. Is that right?
Yes. There was mention of positive Legionellas, and there was mention of high TVCs actually as well. And I said, I remember the conversation just outside the laboratory block, the front doors. And I said, that's something you're going to want to put in writing. I need that in writing. I need to know what's going on. And he said he wouldn't do that.
Now, you say you asked for risk assessments for waterborne infection in the new hospital and you didn't get them. Why did you want to get the risk assessment?
So that I could understand where we were with the risk with water. I was a local ICD. I was working with Pauline. We both agreed that this was something that we wanted to see.
Now, I'm going to jump a little bit because I've been asked to put certain matters to you here. You say you asked for these. Did you ask once, or was this an ask that continued?
I asked 2 or 3 times. They're in my emails. So I put in writing to Ian Powery, and because Tom had said he was the best person to ask, so I asked. I copied in Tom Walsh, as far as I recall, and Craig, and then and Mary-Ann Keane, I can't remember how she got the email, whether I directly asked her, but I was basically moved around the houses. There was ask the project team, then there was, oh, we're no longer here, ask the estates team. Mary-Ann Keane replied, she doesn't know why I was asking her. And Tom Walsh was chair of the board water safety group, I believe, at the time. Nobody seemed to have this information.
We know from other evidence in the inquiry there was a firm called DMA Canyon who did a report in 2015. Can you just tell us, just while we're on this point, when you first knew that saw this report?
2019, I was off on sick leave due to an incident at work, and it was towards the end of my sick leave, I think, because I was feeling better enough that Therese Inkster came to visit. We're kind of jumping ahead in chronology. A lot had happened between then. She showed it to me there at that point. That was the first time I knew of its existence.
And can you assist us at all? And if you can't, please just say, have you any information as to who was aware of that prior to it emerging in, well, we've been told 2018, 2019?
The only information on that I know is from following the inquiry. So I understand Ian Powery was in possession of it. I did not know that until the inquiry.
And in the first bullet point in paragraph 34, you mentioned somebody who sat on the water safety group. Is that Tom Walsh?
Yes.
Did you get the information from him about the water testing?
No.
Thank you. Lord, I'm conscious I've slipped slightly past the 11:30 schedule.
It's only an approximate target.
Any time is as good as any other at the moment, so I'm content to
Dr.
rise.
Peters, as I said, we usually take a coffee break at about 11:30. So if you could be back for 5 to 12. Mr. Connell.
Thank you, my Lord. If we can just go back for reference to where we were in the witness statement, which was at paragraph 34, electronic 117. That paragraph has a number of bullet points, and in effect, I've just dealt with the first bullet point. The second one raises a slightly different question, which is that the representative from, I'll just call them the contractors, and the commissioning team, that's the board's commissioning team, said they didn't know the infectious diseases unit, that's what we've called Brownlee, and the BMT unit, which is sometimes also called the Beatson because it's the adult BMT unit. I'm assuming that's what's being referred to rather than the pediatric BMT unit.
Yes, it's the adult.
And the suggestion is that they didn't know they were on site in the hospital.
That's what was stated. In fact, we had a conversation that we said they were there and they said they weren't. And it was that stark. We said, no, they're here because we're getting microbiology samples. And they're saying, no, they're not here because that was never agreed. It just seemed very strange.
In fact, according to your statement, they said they didn't know that there was ever to be an infectious diseases unit in the new hospital.
Yes.
I mean, perhaps, was that the contractor or was that the contractor and the commissioning team?
My memory of it is that that was from David Hall.
He's the Brookfield representative.
No.
Is he the commissioning team
yes,
representative?
as far as I'm aware.
Right.
Do you happen to remember who the Brookfield representative was?
He was also called David, but I didn't get his second name. So I know there was another David. I never met him again, never met him before, but Ian Parry had told, I wouldn't have known who these people were. It was on Ian's suggestion of who would be the most appropriate people to pull together for this quick fact-finding meeting. So David Hall, I think, did most of the talking, but my impression was all around the table, the people who were there were not in agreement that we had actual bone marrow transplant patients or an infectious diseases unit on site.
Right. It's no doubt my fault. I don't think I've come across the name David Hall before.
I think David Hall, my Lord, appears in the earlier part of paragraph 34 of this statement, I think, where this witness talks about a representative of the Health Board commissioning team, David Hall.
Team. Right. Sorry, I missed
That was my
reference.
understanding of who he was. I don't have confirmation of that. At the meeting, that's what I understood his role was.
Right. Do you know what his professional background was?
Engineering, I think. I don't know beyond that.
Thank you.
So this was you from infection control, Ian Parry from estates, somebody from the commissioning team, i.e. the people who were supposed to get the hospital up and running, to use layman's terms, and the contractor who'd been involved in the build.
Yes.
And in fact, if we stick to David and David, we discover at the end of that bullet point that David Hall, according to you, said he was going to discuss it with another David Loudon.
Yes.
Who was David Loudon, as you understood it?
My understanding was that he was the director of estates for GGC, and also he was the lead on the project.
The lead on the project. So that question of bone marrow transplant and infectious diseases unit, who knew what, was going back to David Loudon.
Yes.
Now, you deal with a number of other issues in this paragraph, which appears on electronic 118. We probably don't need to delay unduly on all of these. You say ventilation arrangements relating to theatres were concerning. Why were they concerning?
Because nobody seemed to know what was happening with them, whether they'd been commissioned. So I would have expected commissioning, and so there's two ways of using the word commissioning. I think we've already been through the engineering commissioning. We also refer to microbiological commissioning of theatres. So that's air sampling. That's a very discrete set of commissioning data. You wouldn't normally do that for ultra clean theatres, but for your normal theatres, at the very beginning, you would expect there to be some microbiological testing. So, but even I was aware that that hadn't been done, or at least I'd asked Ian Parry, but Ian Parry also said he wasn't aware of what the theatre validation and other commissioning was. He didn't have access to that. So that in and of itself was concerning. At that stage, I wasn't able to say that's a problem. That's, you know, the shared prep rooms, that came later. At that stage, just merely the fact that we couldn't instantly say, and here's the stuff that you need to confirm that everything's done and dusted.
So you just so we're clear, you mentioned three different things there. Ian Parry was talking about the kind of commissioning and validation data, so commissioning by the contractor, validation by the board, usually through a specialist, which was done from what you described as an engineering perspective.
Yeah.
And then there's a separate type of commissioning, microbiological commissioning,
Yes.
which you were explaining, involving some form of testing. Is that right?
Yeah, air sampling, and there are cut-offs. And in order to do that, you'd need access. Ian Parry would have to organise access. So you don't just wander into a theatre suite and start doing plates. He would have had to organise that. So he suggested that that had never been done. And later on, I asked Craig and others, and it was clear that that hadn't been done. So there's emails later that we then start to look at the theatres as well. And that was to go up through Anne Harkness's group as well. So at this point in time, I didn't have specifics on if there were any issues with the theatres, just simply the fact that we couldn't see it had all been done appropriately, so that we could be certain we were moving into theatres that were meeting the standards and were commissioned.
The next bullet point you mentioned is the Ebola pathway.
Yeah.
And you say the A&E department had no infection isolation rooms, which presumably you need if you're going to have an extremely infectious patient. Is that right?
Yeah, I think because I was expecting there to be one, because that had been, in fact, I'm sure Anne Harkness had said, because I had pointed out, I have previous to this, when I'd been doing the VHF pathways, I'd put together a number of risks that were inherent in how we were planning to deal with them in A&Es. And really the solution was it's all going to go away as soon as we opened the new A&E. So each A&E department will decide, I think the clinicians would be the best people to know what they want in terms of isolation. You know, you might have one or two single rooms with shut doors, you may have a negative pressure room, or if you were going to be the centre for all Ebolas to come to, if there were, you'd try and spec that up. So I was expecting something to be there that would be, this is designed and planned, rather than retrospectively going and saying, wonder where we can put one of these cases if they come in. Because it's a new build, I'd have expected this to be inherent in the progress of the design and planning.
And the next bullet point says there were PPVL rooms, so that's pressurized rooms with lobbies.
Yeah. Positive
pressure rooms with,
yeah,
which didn't have their own toilet facilities.
Yeah.
Why is that worthy of mention as an issue?
Because the validated template, if you like, the design template for a PPVL room, which was designed by Malcolm Thomas as a solution to the problem of having rooms that you switch from negative to positive, and you can get it wrong, and that can have serious consequences. So this is a clever design to mitigate against that. And it has in it a very clear cascade of air and air directionality that goes from the positive pressure room through the baffles, mixing in the room, and then under the door into the ensuite, and then extracted out. So in and of itself, if it was a deviation from the template, you would expect there to be some sort of accompanying, we know it's not what it says in the SHTM, but here's how we've validated it to show that this works for the purpose that we're trying to use it. So it could have been it was a problem if you had an ambient, a patient who was able to go to the toilet themselves. So then they'd have to come out and use another toilet. So that's not going to work. In an ITU setting, you could conceive of theoretically, you could have a room like that that didn't need a toilet. But the problem was these rooms were in ITU, but they were going to be used for your ID patients who didn't necessarily need ITU treatment. So then you needed a toilet in the suite. So it's a bit nuanced, but the idea of having predetermined and pre-thought through what you were providing in different parts of the hospital seemed to be missing.
And I think later in your statement, you come on to a later stage of events where you actually had a conversation with the individual who designed these clever solutions, as you mentioned them, to avoid, am I picking it up correctly, a previous possibility of having a room with controls on pressure which allowed you to make it negative or positive depending on what you wanted?
Yes. There's good references, there's good evidence in the literature that they can often go wrong. So they're a no-no now. You don't do those kind of rooms.
I understand that. Now, the next point you make was vertical drains leading to pooling water in sinks. Now,
I don't mean vertical, I mean horizontal. Sorry about that. So it's the drain in the back of the sink.
yep.
So instead of your normal drain plug hole, they're known to become contaminated. So this is a solution that you don't get splashback from the water coming from the tap and then pushing back up whatever the nasty stuff down the drain is. And it's to the side, which sounds like a good idea. But I think you have to have the sink at exactly the right angle as well. So it is fully draining. And what I didn't know, but I know now, is that there's a problem with the sealant causing a lip. I was not aware of that previously. I just, on the basis of my visual checks, there's little pooling at that exit point, and you get a rim of green, which would imply biofilm and collection of bacteria.
And the final bullet point in the list is rooms described as NPV rooms were not negatively pressured. Now, is this something we've discussed before? Is this a new point?
No, it's the same point. So people were referring to the PPVL rooms as negative pressure rooms, and they were planning to use them in the same way as a negative pressure room, which is not appropriate. So you need to understand how you would monitor it and how you would know with regard to the pressure differentials and to know what the risk factors are in the PPVL room as opposed to a negative pressure room. And the main, apart from the lobby, if you just think of the lobby as a space to change, that's a very different concept from your lobby as actually an airlock, if you like, an air space that will prevent air coming one way or the other. So the importance of the doors both being shut, never having both doors open at the same time, that sort of thing. And the bedroom where the patient is, in this concept, is neutral pressure to the corridor. So the only thing that's positively pressured is the lobby, not the neutral pressure bedroom. And that's where there's controversy, because one line of thinking, which would be represented, as I understand it, by Peter Hoffman, who I've discussed it with, would be that that doesn't actually then do the job it needs to do for an immunocompromised patient, where you want a positive pressure around the patient themselves and not allow ingress through all the little gaps. And for the reverse for immunocompromised patients, where you actually want a negative pressure in relation to the corridor.
Now, I think you said immunocompromised twice there, once for positive pressure, but it's an infectious patient who needs negative pressure.
Yes, sorry, infectious patient.
Yeah. So the challenge, as I am understanding you, is if you have an immunocompromised patient, I'm just keen that His Lordship understands the point you're trying to make. An immunocompromised patient requires positive pressure to ensure that stuff from outside doesn't get in and infect them, to be very lay in my terms. So under this system, the lobby is the only bit that's positively pressurized.
Correct.
So that is presumably designed to stop anything going into the lobby.
It prevents air from the corridor ingressing through the lobby, which is the main space of air. That's, when you open the door, that's where the most risk of air going one way or the other is. So it's a very good design for that. What it's not so good at is all the little leaks that will, even if you do a leak test over time, things will disintegrate and you will get, for example, where the services go in the walls, there will always be little gaps between, which for a immunocompromised patient could be an issue if there's a leak, for example, and you get mold in that space behind. And okay, you're not getting air from outside coming in, but you've potentially got ingress of mold into the room. Whereas if the bedroom is positively pressured, the air is always going away, always going out of the room. It's quite the controversy is about how much that matters and how much the leakage, what risk it poses. I'm sorry. The issues I've identified, and not just me, my colleagues within the Queen Elizabeth in using these rooms, is that actually where they're placed is also very important. So, for example, one of them, well, a few of them are immediately opposite an open bay bed. So the design seems to think about a corridor where there's no patients. So you've got a neutral to the corridor. So that's, it's not a very high risk space. Whereas if it's in the middle of an ITU, that wall and this big window with potential sealant breaking down and with I think I put it in somewhere, the mechanism for the blinds breaking, you've actually got a hole about this size and you've got another patient there. So if you had MDR-TB in there, there's no no negative pressure pulling it in. You could have, if you open the door here, some of it will come out. How to quantify that risk? You'd need somebody who does the modelling and maths around it. Just conceptually, it doesn't seem to be what was designed and what was expected in the SHTM.
So this debate is all about the use of lobbies as a mechanism, as opposed to simply, for instance, a negative pressure room for an infectious patient.
You can have suites. So as soon as you've got a bedroom and a lobby, you call it a suite. So you can have a cascade of negative pressure. So the room is higher negative pressure than the lobby. And the lobby is also negative pressure to the corridor. So the air is always going that way. And the reverse, you can have a positive pressure room, which is positive to the lobby, which is positive to the corridor. So the air is always coming this way. And the lobby is handy because then you can do activities in there and have a double lock. So you're massively increasing the protective factor by having two doors. So you can open one, open the other, and it's giving an extra factor. Where the PPVL rooms really come into their own is where you've got an infectious immunocompromised patient. So say you have an immunocompromised patient who also has chickenpox. You can't have negative and positive at the same time in the room, but the next best thing would be to have. So they do have, I think, a role and they're a unique property, but whether they're the right thing for an ICU ID type patient, I don't think they fit there. That's if they were all built exactly right. The problems we had at the Queen Elizabeth was that they weren't actually built to the design anyway. So I accept there is dubiety around whether they're the right choice of suite, but that comes second to whether they were built to plan in the first place.
So so I'm understanding this as a non-ventilation engineer. The example that you posited was somebody who was both immunocompromised and had caught some illness which was infectious. So you've got two things driving in a different direction. One, you can't allow contact with outside contaminants because the person is immunocompromised. On the other hand, you don't want the air spilling into the corridor and infecting other people. So am I right in understanding you're saying that a lobby system can work there?
Yes. It's a good way of getting compromising on both risks.
So what would you have, a neutral room and a...
Yeah, so the PPVL room, so the neutral room, because then it's minimal amount coming in and out. It's not nothing. The other The reverse concept, which I think is in the American guidance, is a negative pressure lobby. So the air, instead of being pushed into the lobby, is removed through the lobby. And that's what is used for that exact same circumstance. So there's a number of solutions. And as long as you understand what you've got, you can use it appropriately. And I think that was the basic factor here.
Thank you. Just for completeness, if we could look at Bundle 14, Volume 1, 332, please. Ah, right. I'll need to go back to 331, my fault. Oh, that's it. What you say in your statement is that following the meeting, during which a range of things are discussed, you sent a summary to Mr. Powery. This is where David comes in, I see, and you summarize there, whole building mechanically ventilated. None of the positive pressure lobby rooms have HEPA filtered supply. None of the lobbied rooms have been leak tested. Extract in the bedroom, in the roof, and various other things. So this is you trying to summarize a range of issues for Ian Powery, is that correct?
It was to check that I'd picked it up. Usually after a meeting, that's not a formal minuted meeting, I would do a list of what I thought I'd taken from it to get
Yeah, so
that.
you might have got something wrong, in which case he'd come back and tell you.
Yeah.
And I think on 332, I think that email just completes with a whole range of other points about commissioning and validation data, not had infection control sign-off, no easy to read collection of relevant documents for specialized ventilated areas, including design spec, commissioning and validation data. That was obviously another issue.
Yes.
Light fittings in Schiehallion not sealed. Now, Schiehallion was designed to be the pediatric BMT unit, is that right?
Yes.
So they would normally require high air change rates and pressure differentials as well.
Yes.
Am I right in thinking you can't really have the pressure differentials if the room's leaking?
It's difficult to achieve the pressure, but you could if you put lots and lots of air in. But the issue with this, it's hard to achieve the pressure differential because it's leaking out. It's like trying to blow up a balloon with holes in it. If you put a lot of effort in, you could maybe sustain it for a bit of time. The other problem is with the ceiling not being sealed off is that whenever you have a ceiling space, there's always dust in there. There's always bits, and so you've got ingress of air that is not filtered coming into the room. And that's the big problem. The Schiehallion aspect of it was Teresa had been alerted to this, and she had been dealing with the Schiehallion aspect because she was covering for Craig, who was not only lead ICD, he was the pediatric ICD. So she was covering him for that. So I didn't really have any remit over the pediatric side of it.
Yeah, it sounds from the bit at the end of that email as if one possible output of the meeting was you were going to get a nice, neat, let's call it a folder for the moment in old paper speak, of ventilation specifications for everything with validation data and so on. That's what you were hoping to get, was it?
Yeah.
Did you get it?
Never.
Thank you. And a number of matters were to be discussed with Mr. Loudon. Now, can we go back to your witness statement, please? Because we're going to move on to a slightly different topic in an area that ultimately turned out to involve quite a lot of issues, which was the Ward 4B, the intended home for the Beatson bone marrow transplant unit to move into. Now, the first question is, why were you involved at all in looking at 4B at this early stage?
At that stage, Teresa hadn't come over to the south. There had been discussions of her being in charge of regional, so it's a regional service. And there hadn't really been any agreement about how the infection control sessions and responsibilities rather than sessions would be divided up. And Teresa was cited as the acting lead ICD when Craig was away on these issues, and we decided just together that I would go up. She was dealing with Shahalian and other issues. I would go up and just have a look.
You say that you'd seen a ventilation specification. What had you seen?
Ian Powery had shown me a piece of paper. I'm trying to remember exactly what. And what I picked up from it, I think it was probably the, it had 2009 written in handwriting at the top, and it had what I think was John Hood's suggestion of a spec for 4B for a hemato-oncology, not BMT ward. But now we had bone marrow transplant. So what I was looking for was the 10 Pascals, 10 ACH, positive pressure monitoring, HEPA filtration, all of that stuff. And what he showed me didn't match with that. And then also, I'm not sure where it comes in my statement, but straight after that meeting with David Hall, Teresa and I liaised. As soon as they said they didn't think bone marrow transplant were there, a red flag. So I said I'd go up to 4B and just see what was there.
Yeah.
And that's how it progressed.
Okay, let me just take you back
Sure.
at least one step in that answer. I can understand the red flag, because if the builders say, oh, we didn't know there was a bone marrow transplant unit from the Beatson here, your question is, well, is the place there meant to be ready for them? I can understand that. But you reeled off a list of things that you would be expecting for a BMT unit. I think it started with 10 air changes. Where do you got that from?
Neutropenic rooms. So they're also very standard concept.
Sorry, can you just give me that again?
Neutropenic rooms, neutropenics from the SHTM 04.
Right, okay. So,
yeah.
I mean, sorry to be so pedestrian. Was your source SHTM 0301?
Yes.
Right. And you had familiarized yourself with that before this? Well,
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, that's the wrong way of putting it. You were aware of these parameters
Oh, yeah.
before the meeting?
It would be a question in your FRC path. So, you know, our exams for FRC path may have questions on ventilation. So it's something that I would teach trainees now. It's a very basic understanding of what positive pressure is. It's not just about the positive pressure. That's a kind of shorthand. It's a shorthand for that kind of room. So pressure in itself isn't enough. It's also the air exchanges and also where the air goes. So it has to be from dirty to clean, as well as the materials that you would use. So there's a whole, you know, host of things that go in, because the underlying premise is that you are trying to minimize any contamination that the patient who's completely neutropenic or high risk of infection. So it's a pretty basic concept.
So when I didn't mean to be pejorative when I said you reeled off a list, but you gave us fairly quickly a list, which started with, I think, 10 air changes an hour, and was also a figure for pascals of pressure.
Yeah, 10, but there's the way John Hood would explain it is that as long as it's between 5 and 10, it's so that it's enough to be a constant pressure, whereas something around 2 pascals is too small, and even your instruments to measure that, there's an error range in your measurement. So if you do 0.1 positive, for example, it means nothing, because your instrument isn't really able to differentiate, and it's a meaningless amount. So you need a good going positive pressure. If you say 10, there's a bit of room for wiggle room, and some guidance will have it higher, 12, but that's the sort of idea.
Yeah. And did you say a pressure cascade
Yes.
as well? And that's to what effect in a room for a neutropenic patient?
Positive in the room to the toilet, so nothing comes back out of the toilet, and positive to the corridor. And if you have a lobby as well, positive to the lobby, and the lobby to the corridor. So the air is always going away from the room.
And did you also mention alarms?
I don't think I mentioned alarms just now, but yes, that would be integral. So you'd have to have a way of a visual measure of what the air pressure was doing in real time. So either a gauge that has like an arrow on it, or a digital gauge, but a gauge, and then an alarm system so that if it drops below a certain amount, then you would be alerted to it and could act accordingly.
Thank you. Now, in paragraph 36 of your statement on electronic 118, you expressed the fact that you were concerned, you'd seen the specification, thought it was inadequate. Why had you asked about Legionella positives? You seem to have asked Mr. Parry about them.
Because he mentioned them to me verbally.
And was he able to tell you whether they'd come from 4B?
No.
And then, in fact, in answer to a question from His Lordship, you explained that you might well get a question on air changes in a neutropenic room in your FRC path exam. But I see here you also record you were familiar with SHCM documents from your time in Crosshouse.
Yes.
So you were concerned about it. You'd spoken to Mr. Parry, which didn't allay your concerns. And then so you actually went to go and see the ward.
Yes.
And you describe here being approached by a member of the nursing staff. Is that right?
She's a manager, quality manager. I can't remember her exact title.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It may not matter for our purposes, but somebody from the nursing team approached you. Now, am I right in thinking that in the transfer from the Beatson, it wasn't just a question of physical rooms, but people moved across as well?
Yeah, so the team, it's a very highly specialist team. The bone marrow transplant and hemonc team, they came across because the service includes the expertise as well as the rooms. So the two go together.
Yeah. So if you're talking to somebody, at least at that time when it's all just happened, in 4B, they're likely to have been someone who'd been working in the Beatson and had moved across.
Definitely, yes.
Yes, I see. And the member staff explained that there was a concern about pressure gauges. Is that what you've just been telling us about?
Yeah, it was. I just went up and I introduced myself because I didn't know them. I hadn't worked at the Beats and I'd never worked in the North. And I said I was infection control doctor on the site, and they were delighted to see somebody from infection control. And they just had these really big concerns because it wasn't the same as what they'd come from. And they know enough, obviously, that positive pressure and a protective environment is really important for their patient cohort. And they couldn't visibly see any signs that that was in place because they would be used to checking on the gauges where it was at.
Right. So I think the narrative in paragraph 37, which continues on electronic 119, suggests that you did what I might kindly describe as a less than highly scientific testing mechanism to see what you could find.
Yeah, so actually, a visual indication of which way the air is going is actually better. So I also do biosafety in labs. So when we have a cabinet, a biosafety cabinet, the best way of knowing for sure which way the air is going is to have a visual. So we used to have a ribbon in our cabinets to show that the air is going in and not coming out, because any instrument you use has a failure rate. So when you're doing something like working with TB that you really don't want to inhale, to have a visual, now that a ribbon's an old-fashioned way, but also you have now clear ducting so you can see that the air is pushing and taking it. So a visual measure of which way the air is going is better. So you can use a piece of tissue and it's not giving you magnitude. So you can't say, oh, I can tell that it's so many pascals. All you're doing with a piece of tissue is saying the air is going that way or it's going that way. And if it's going the wrong way, it doesn't matter what the gauge says. It's not doing what it's meant to be doing. And
you used a tissue on a patient room in 4B to see what would happen. Is that right?
Yes, and the air was going in.
Which is presumably the opposite of what you want.
So you want it coming out and it was going in.
Did you do this once or more than once?
I did it on a number of doors, yeah.
And were the results the same or different?
Some there wasn't much movement, but mostly it was going in. It was variable, but you'd expect that. And also it depends where you do it on the wall. So air's movement is very complex in a space, and because you can't see it, it's quite hard to. You need an indication of what's happening. So it could be because of the air stratification. If it's warmer higher up, the air might be going in, and lower down, it's coming out. So there is a range of it. So I was doing it at the bottom of the door because that was the biggest gap. So the air was going in mostly. So it wasn't, it's as you say, it's not scientific enough to say this is a fail or a pass, but it's enough to say this is not doing what I expect it to do, which would be a good going positive pressure at every stage with the doors shut.
Then this is perhaps a slight side issue to the more general question of 4B, but you went to something called a pentamidine room.
Pentamidine room, yes.
Pentamidine, yes. Apologies for my mispronunciation. This you record, and I think we have this elsewhere, it is a substance that has toxicity to a particular cohort, which is women who happen to be pregnant. And therefore you try not to let any of it out, presumably.
Correct.
And did you use your tissue test on that one?
Yeah, and it was positive pressure. So it was coming out. And that had also been, that became a bit, people denied that was the case later on. And I've always been a bit confused because all I can be sure of is on that morning or afternoon, whatever it was, I'd expected it to be negative pressure and there was air, like a good going draft coming out. And I, at different stages, saw people there trying to sort it out and they apparently found it very difficult to change it. And then at one stage I've been told that actually because it needs a local exhaust, and if the local exhaust wasn't on, it wouldn't be negative pressure. And that was the reason. I don't know, I haven't seen enough details, but I've also seen in some of the documents that actually somebody else said it was actually negatively pressured later on. So I have to say I have an open mind on that. I'm not sure what the absolute evidence is for that, but I did raise it, even though it wasn't infection control, it's a health and safety issue. And given there were so many other things that weren't as they ought to be, I highlighted that. And I haven't followed that through because, as I say, it wasn't our remit.
Yeah, because what you're not dealing with infection there.
No, it's not an infection issue.
With a safety issue. Yeah, I see. Now, in the next paragraph 38, I'm not clear from your statement whether you're dealing with something that cropped up on your visit after you met the member of the nursing staff, or whether this is a more general comment on issues about blinds breaking.
It's more general. It's not from that visit. I don't think there were anything breaking in 4B that I recall. It's more at about the same time, there was lots of people reporting issues. You'd go round wards and they'd have plastic aprons stuck up on the windows because it becomes a privacy issue because they're internal blinds. Yeah. So if you can't shut them and if they've locked open, if you like, there's a big privacy issue for the patients inside.
As I understand it, this is the design that you sometimes see where there are two panes of glass with a call it a Venetian blind,
Yeah.
a set of blinds in between the glass. And the issue was whether you could get them to open or shut.
There was a mechanism, as I understand it, defect almost throughout the whole building. So there was a big program of works to replace them. And the relevance of that is really that when you've got a sealed room that you're bothering to do a leak test on, and you've got this mechanism which basically just opens up a hole straight from the leak tested room into the corridor, that's a defect.
Now, when we go on to paragraph 39, 39, yes, still on electronic page 119, you say all the rooms in 4B are meant to have HEPA filtration. That's presumably because the patients have to make sure that they have clean air at all times.
Yes.
And the HEPA filter, we know, is a high degree of filtration which filters out the vast majority of things that might be harmful, to take a non-technical description. Is that correct?
Yes.
And according to this, you were told by Mr. Perry that some of them didn't have HEPA filters, but nobody knew which.
That's right.
I take it it's not obvious when you go into a room.
It is actually, if you look up into because they're point of supply filters, you look up through the supply grill, you can see the HEPA filter. If it was up in the air handling unit, as some places will do the HEPA filtration at the level of the air handling unit, but I think because these were such long pieces of ducting going down to the rooms, it would be sensible to put HEPAs at the point of supply, so you can actually see visibly if they're there or not.
You make a comment about the rooms also not being sealed. So if you have a HEPA filter but the room's not sealed, does that work for protection?
No, because it's the HEPA is one aspect of it, and the positive pressure and the air changes are another aspect of the control of the air level of contamination. So the HEPA is purely about the air coming in from outside being cleaned, so that you can be sure that it's a HEPA grade level of air that is being supplied. The air exchanges are about diluting, so there are other ways for air bacteria, spores of fungi to enter the room, and that can be, for example, as I mentioned, mold in the area, or people coming in, or somebody coughing, say a staff member coming in with COVID coughing. Then you want that removed. The HEPA is doing nothing for you in that setting. So you want the air to exchange quickly, and you also want it to go in the right direction. You want it to go out through the ensuite and up and out. So you've got control. The whole point of a ventilation system is to have control of what's happening with the air, where it's going, and giving some sort of thought to where the contamination is coming from and what it's likely to do.
Now, according to your witness statement, you had this visit on the 25th of June of 2015, and you say in paragraph 40 of your statement that you were escalating them immediately because you thought they were causing immediate risks. And who were you escalating them to?
Tom Walsh is the manager, and I copied in Brian Jones as he was the microbiologist who gave clinical microbiology advice to the bone marrow transplant unit. So those were the two routes, and also Teresa was included in all my emails as well, because she was acting for Craig, and Tom Walsh was the manager, so he would be in the best position to coordinate and take things forward. I actually didn't know what else to do. It's a really surprising situation to be in, and for me, the immediate impact was the highly infectious type of patient, which we could expect because we were now the Brownlee unit, and the very immunocompromised patients who were there and then having their bone marrow transplants done. So they're given treatments, so life-saving treatment, essential treatment, not the sort of thing you want to put off in a situation which was, it was just uncontrolled. And that's not what you want. You want a controlled setting where you know what the risks are, you know exactly what standards you're meeting, so that you can do something sensible around reducing the risk to those patients.
So at that time, when you went to 4B, were there patients in it?
Yes.
So whatever stage their treatment at, now, these were people that come over from the Brownlee BMT unit.
Yes.
Can we look at bundle 12-225, please? So this is dated the 26th of June, which is the day after your visit. You're sending it to Tom Walsh, as you mentioned, copy to Teresa Inkster and Pauline Wright. And the BMT issue is number 2.
I make an error there. I've put 5B, and that was actually, that's what was that meeting we had with David Hall. Everybody was talking about the BMT unit being on 5B. There was confusion even as to what floor it was on. Now I should have known because I went to the 4th floor, but for some reason I had it in my head it was 5B because that's what everybody was talking about. But that is in fact an error. It should be 4B.
And at that point, you're waiting documentation on the specification and also on validation.
Yes.
And the tail piece of that email is basically saying, well, tell me how to pull this all together to best effect. I'm
Yes.
paraphrasing. What did you expect to happen when you had patients in an environment which, on the face of it, even with your non-scientific test, wasn't what you would have expected?
I would expect a pretty high level escalation quickly with some sort of meeting to find out where we were, what we could do immediately to mitigate those risks, try and quantify the risks, and then secondly, find out how we'd got here and how extensive the problem is.
At that point, did you know what the air change rates were?
No. Well, I knew there was a spec and it seemed wrong to me anyway, but I didn't know what was actually supplied. So when I say spec, it's not this is what we've got. We think this is what we asked for. And that was a phrase actually that the person from Multiplex used in that meeting was, you've got what you've asked for. And I said, I haven't asked for anything. All I'm interested in is my patients today. So there was a bit of kickback as to why are you asking for this information? And I was saying, well, I'm an ICD today and I have patients today and I need to know where to put them. And so that's where that conversation, sorry, I'm backtracking a little bit, about, well, they were never meant to be here. So you've got what you wanted. You've got what you wanted.
Sorry, it's entirely my fault because I was
Yes, sorry.
reading the minute and not paying sufficient attention to the evidence. The meeting at which you were told you've got what you want, just remind me, when was that and with whom?
I'm referring back, sorry, to the meeting with Ian Parry and David Hall and Multiplex.
Right, okay.
So that was the phrase, and it kept coming back throughout, is it's what you've asked for, so you can't get something different. And I had a different approach, which was, I have patients now.
Yes.
Where are we?
Right.
So that then, I think by this stage, there was a lot going on. And I thought it was of immediate risk, infection risk. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know the system. I didn't, part of this being AICC, BICC, the only thing you can do is escalate through your channels. So I escalate up to Tom Walsh and I specifically ask, what should I do? I'll do whatever I need to do. I was willing to take it on, whatever, but it needed to be coordinated because we'd already had, I was conscious of a lot of emails, and you can see all of them if you like. kind of just put this summary one. I'd done a gap analysis for both a bone marrow transplant patient and also for the infectious diseases patients. I'd done a few, as things emerged, I wanted to make sure people are up to date. I believe I sent this specific email on to Brian, even though he's not copied in. A lot of people needed to know, but how you were going to get a solution was the tricky bit.
Thank you. Can we just look at 227 in the same bundle, please? And this is Tom Walsh coming back to you on the same day, saying at the top there, thanks for all the information. We're escalating to the Chief Operating Officer and Medical Director. Thank you. The Chief Operating Officer, do you know who that was at the time? You may don't remember.
Grant Archibald.
And the Medical Director?
Jennifer Armstrong.
And we can leave that document, thank you. Go back to the witness statement. In paragraph 41, you talked about doing, that's on page 120, you talked about doing what you described as a gap analysis. What PPV patients needed and what BMT patients needed. So when you, as we described it, reeled off things that a BMT patient needed, 10 air changes, 10 or thereabouts pascals of positive pressure, air cascades, alarms or gauges. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about laying out?
Yes, and at that stage I would have cross-checked with the SHTM. So, I had an idea, but the SHTMs aren't the sort of thing you hold in your brain in their entirety. So you always go back with reference. So I went back, reread, and I put the references, and of course CDC is another source of very good information on this sort of thing. And also for the bone marrow transplant, I was aware of the JC guidance, which is the organization that accredits a bone marrow transplant service that covers the entirety of the service. And you really need that to have a quality assured process around bone marrow transplantation. So I was keen that our input from a microbiology infection control point of view was as informed by those streams of information, so that I could be sure my memory's not, because you do forget these numbers, even though I said I can trip it off, but you still make errors. So I did double check in doing that gap analysis, and then I left a gap in the column for what we actually have, because there was a lot of unknown information. So I had hints and I had thoughts and I had some verbal reports, but I wanted to have, basically we didn't have validation, and that's the problem. We didn't know what we had. So you're forever playing catch up. You got no starting point, and it was just this lack of a starting point that became very difficult.
I think other things were done in 4B at that time that you tell us about. In paragraph 43, you're talking there about a program of Legionella water surveillance in that particular ward, and you say the beats and monitoring program hadn't been implemented. What's the point there? So the
Beatson was a long-standing setup, and it was deemed to be world class. John Hood had spent a lot of time designing and validating that building, and he would give us lectures as a trainee about setting it up, and water was always a big component. And I think they had, I'm not as au fait with water systems as I am with ventilation, but they had a heating system near to the outlet, I think. But there was, Teresa had been for a number of years involved in the monitoring of the environment there. So air sampling results and water results, they had a system in place, which I was not familiar with. So it wasn't something I would say, it wouldn't be off my own bat. Pauline I'd liaised with Teresa because it was separate. This is really separate to our finding issues. It was more, here's what we do. We've now migrated. Let's make sure that we've migrated the good practices as well from a microbiology point of view. So that's where that came in. And because I'd heard there was Legionella and we hadn't seen those results, then we kind of need to start from scratch. And at least now, those results should be following the normal process, which would be to the infection control doctor who's covering that area, which became Teresa when she covered regional.
So the net result of all of that was a regular program of checking in that ward for water safety issues like Legionella.
I've not been involved in those, so I can't say when that started or what those results did, because as I say, Teresa became, and they moved back anyway, so actually became a moot point.
The next paragraph, you move from water back to air sampling.
Yeah.
Because those 30th June, so that's a few days after you've been in the ward and after you've escalated to Tom Walsh and he's escalated elsewhere, there's then air sampling in both 4B and 2A, which is the pediatric BMT unit. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, this is just what it says, isn't it? This is just taking samples of the air and then trying to check what you find there in terms of particles.
There's two components to air sampling in this setup, and you do particle counts, which can be, some of those will be infectious particles and others won't, they'll be inert, so dust, so particle counts can go up with pollution, with all sorts of things, whereas the agar plate, so we'll use now old-fashioned way of monitoring air. So the monitoring of air quality has come on massively, particularly through COVID. But at that time, it was a fairly standard process. So you have it's called an Anderson sampler, and it pulls air at a certain volume over a certain time onto impacts onto an agar plate. And there's a very well-established system that was already in place in the Beatson, that I'm sure Teresa could speak more to, but I was aware of it, where over 5-6 years they've very well established levels of what you would expect to see, and then if there's a deviation from your norm, you go in and you inspect it, and quite often you will find either a source of damp or something else. So there's a sort of heads up with the particle count, and then there's a qualitative and semi-quantitative idea with the agar plates. So then takes quite a while for fungus to grow through. So you incubate for 5 to 7 days, and then you identify what you grow. As far as I'm aware, they weren't doing bacterial testing, and I think bacterial air testing is probably becoming more considered to be a useful way of understanding how the environment and microbes within a space interact. So at that time, it would just be looking for fungus, counting them, counting the particles, and you would expect less than 1, basically 0 molds, and particle counts should be below 100. Now, if you get an aberrant count, you may look for reasons. Maybe somebody came in and shook the bedclothes, or something can put the particle count out quickly. So a one-off is not meaningful, but a trend is. However, in this situation, the counts were they were in the millions. It wasn't just a little bit off. It was just wildly off. There were lots of fungus on all the plates and huge counts. In some rooms, massive counts, kind of as big as outdoor counts. So, which you're going to find a lot more particles outdoors, and the filters in the system will be reducing that down to your indoor space. So it was, you don't do things just to achieve your testing results of 0, but the testing is a tool, a signal, a point of data that helps you analyze what your environment is like. So it's not an end in itself, it's a tool to help you understand what's going on. And if you already knew, if you knew there was no HEPA there, and there's no positive pressure, and there's 3 ACHs for the sake of argument, you would really expect these. You'd say that's not surprising. So you don't need the testing to tell you your ventilation's wrong. It's unfortunate the way this happened because there was so little information. But this then really became something that people could focus their minds on, people who maybe didn't understand ventilation and its spec, and say, maybe it does matter because we've now got something physical to show.
If you get high particle counts in areas of the hospital with immunocompromised individuals, is that risky?
The particle count in itself is not a risk. It depends what those particles are. It's an indicator of a bigger problem. So the risk is the amount of, the risk is that the particles indicate that there may be high rates of fungal spores, bacterial spores in the air.
Thank you. And this was done in both 4B and in 2A.
Yes.
Were the results similar or different? Can you remember?
So from what I understand, yes, from conversations, but I would not have seen the 2A results. I just know from Teresa and from us discussing it. Yes.
The reason I asked that is this is back in 2015, and we know that things were then done about 4B. We can debate what was done, but things were done fairly rapidly. People went back to the Beatson and so on. 2A wasn't altered for, major alterations didn't take place in 2A until well into 2018 or thereabouts. It seems a little odd that you're picking up these things so early and yet there's a gap. I mean, just looking in very general terms, do you know why it took so long?
I think it speaks to a lack of a joined up approach where we really needed to say, let's start again from scratch. We don't actually know what we have, and take it from there. There wasn't a systematic, everybody involved. Things seem to happen in pockets of activity across the organisation that I wasn't privy to. Teresa wasn't privy to some of it. From my limited visibility, I raised things, got involved, and then blocked out. And there's no further information. And you're then in the position where you're hoping something's happening, but not in the sure knowledge that something's happening.
So in any event, what happened at this time in relation to 4B was pretty swiftly after the air sampling was done, there was a meeting. Leave aside whether there were attempts to put it off, doesn't matter now. And the meeting was chaired by Gary Jenkins.
Correct.
And you've listed others present, including Mr. Parry, Ms. Ioannidis, Jackie Valman-Roy, and yourself. And basically, that was a kind of meeting that didn't come to a conclusion because you felt you needed more information.
There was it is a very big thing to move a bone marrow transplant unit back. I mean, that was going to be a huge deal. So was that we didn't have enough knowledge at that stage to know, maybe it's just a HEPA missing. I didn't think it was. Or maybe there's something in the system somewhere that explains this. Surely we haven't got it that badly wrong. And maybe there's things, we needed to do things straight away because there were patients there. So whenever you have an infection control incident, your first thing is what immediate actions can I take and safety, and then what more information do we need, and then how do we take forward a plan in a risk assessed way. So a lot of things.
The question I wanted to ask you, I think, just to follow that, was this, that this is only July 2015, so this is pretty quickly after the hospital opened. But according to what you've said here, people who've been gathered didn't know what the position was. That might be thought to be a little odd, that no one in the room was able to say, oh, well, the answer is X or Y or Z.
Yeah, and I had a meeting with them, but I'm aware that I was aware at the time because I walked in on a meeting. There were other meetings that I was not invited to. I definitely had a sense that there were conversations going on that I wasn't privy to as well. And that's why I'd asked Tom, like, how do we pull this together? There's so many spin-off communications going on. So we really did push hard for that meeting where absolutely the clinicians had to be involved. We needed some more information to bring to the clinicians. So we couldn't say, oh, I think it's probably not that great. You needed to say, here are what we think the problems are. And we've tried. So there was an attempt to increase the ACH. And it's at that point I learned from Ian Parry, and Ian Parry was incredibly helpful. My impression from him at that time was he was completely in lockstep with Therese and I about concerns about these parameters. And he first drew my attention to the fact that you can't just ramp up an air handling unit to twice the amount. And that showed the kind of engineering limitation of my knowledge at the time. I was just, we need this air changes. That's as far as I could go. But that's how, in the middle of an incident, you up your expertise, because he explained the electrics are all spec'd for this, the ducting spec'd for this, the fan speed, everything, and it's to a capacity that we don't have a lot of wriggle room. So he was, educating us as we were educating him about this situation, and he was extremely helpful in that situation. So I think things were becoming news to him as well, and we were liaising very closely about that, and then Brookfield were somehow involved, and that would be Ian's involvement with them. And the impression I got was there was a lot of pushback about how we would, what were we expecting, because this is what we wanted. And me, as a primarily concerned with the patients in the rooms, it's immaterial in a way, who asked for what. These are the patients now without the right amount of air and with really very heavily contaminated air, and we're knocking out their bone marrow to give them, give them the treatment they need. So that's a very long answer. I'm sorry, I've forgotten exactly what the first bit was.
Not to worry at all. I'll ask you, perhaps, with His Lordship's permission, one more question just before we break. If we go to electronic 120, no, sorry, 121. We're looking there at the meeting we've just been discussing in paragraph 45. Decision that further information was required, and then you emailed the project team to try and get more information. Did you get it?
No.
Okay. Well, I think that, my lord, might be an appropriate point at which to stop. We are in the middle of a narrative, but it's likely to run a little longer.
Yes, well, we'll take our lunch break now. Dr. Peters, if you could be back for 2 o'clock.
Thank you.
Please stand.